Welcome back to Student Tutorials. In this video, we're going to be doing a very basic introduction to C++, and we're going to be looking at a few of the differences between Python and C++. Now, the biggest difference and the most important difference is that Python is interpreted and C++ is compiled. Now, what this means is that, well, for example, when you run your code on Python, your computer works through the code line by line by line as you run it, and it turns it into machine code, which is code the computer can actually understand rather than what you've written. C++, however, you have to do something called compilation, which is where, before you even run it, you have to turn all of that code into machine code first. So you do this beforehand, before you run it. And this can help in some scenarios, especially when we have low-power devices like an Arduino, because it means that the Arduino isn't doing anywhere near as much processing, turning that code into machine code when it runs. It's just doing what it's told by machine code that's already there. So it really helps out. It's also worth noting that Arduinos do use a slightly modified version of C++, so it's not exactly the same as what you might do if you do a C++ project. It's almost exactly the same, it just has a few extra functions that make it useful for talking to actual hardware, like an Arduino and things that are connected to it. Okay, so when you open up a new sketch in Arduino, you're going to see these two functions here, void setup and void loop. And you're going to want to know what they mean, and they're very important. They're the two most important functions that you use when you're playing with Arduinos. The name kind of gives it away here. Void setup is where you're going to put the code that you need to set up your Arduino. So you might specify what devices are connected to what ports, or you might specify how fast you want your code to run. That all gets done in that function there. Void loop as well, in the name. This is the code that loops round and round and round, and it will keep running that code until you physically tell it to stop or you unplug the Arduino. It will run indefinitely. So this is where you're going to put the code for your temperature sensors or your solar panel, anything that needs to be constantly done to obtain data, you're going to put it in the loop there. Okay, so now we're going to do just a very basic example so you can see how very basic statements are put together in Arduino, C++ for Arduino. Okay. So first things first, here is just a new sketch. This is what you'll see when you open up a sketch. And what you always need to do every time is in the setup, you need to write serial.begin, not that, begin 9600. Now, what this means is that we are beginning a serial connection at 9600 bits per second. If we don't put this line, there will be no connection to the serial monitor on the Arduino. We won't be able to see what's happening, so you need to have this line. That's all it's doing there. Okay. Next, all we're going to do is just add together two numbers. Now, the biggest difference to Python here is that when you define a variable in Python, you could just write x is 5, for example. That doesn't work here. Python is a bit smarter in that it can kind of try and guess what data type you're using. C++ does not. You have to define exactly what data type you're going to be using. So what you do is, we're going to just use integers here. You have to write int for an integer, and then what you want to call your variable. So you could say int x equals 5, and that's your statement now. The final thing you have to do on every statement you make is add a semicolon to the end. Otherwise, your code will not run. It will error out. And unlike Python, where some of your code may run, but some of it won't, if there's something wrong in your C++ code, it will just not work. None of it will work, because it all has to compile first. Okay, so we've got our first integer, x is 5. And then we're going to be doing the same with y. Let's say that y is 6. We're then going to define a third variable, x, z. And we're going to say it's equal to x plus y. Now, if we want to print that, we're going to be using the serial dot thing again. So when you want to access something like the serial monitor and you want to do something to it, you generally have to put serial dot and then anything you want to do. And what we want to do here is print out what x plus y is. So we're going to do serial.print. And you see this bit here, it helps you along a little bit with some of the commands you can do. So we're going to do serial.print z. Again, remembering semicolon. People forget semicolons all the time. Professionals have done it for years, do it all the time, so try and remember. Now, if we go ahead and press the tick button to verify, you see that there's no errors, which is good. And make sure you're connected to Arduino, and then we're going to upload it to the Arduino. And you're not going to see anything to begin with. And that's because if you want to see it, you have to open the serial monitor. So we're going to go to the serial monitor, which is this magnifying glass in the top right. And you'll see some absolute junk, and then you'll see one spammed, which is simply because we've got 5 plus 6, which is 11, so spamming 11s. Let's say we wanted it on a new line. We could simply do print ln z, which is like print line z. So every time it prints, it's going to print on a new line. And we can upload that. And we look at it now. It's now putting 11s down the way, which is a little bit more useful, and that's probably what you're going to use most of the time when you're doing thermometers. As far as operations go, we could do x times y. They're very similar to Python. And you'll see that eventually it should do 30. Great. Same for divide. So just a slash for divide. Compile that again. It's going to be 0. And the one difference here is that if you want to do the modulus of two numbers, you do a percent sign. It's a bit different to Python. And yeah, you get 5. Anyway, that's everything for this video. In the next video, we're going to be looking at some functional programming, so how we can actually use the Arduino to interface with different devices like the thermometers. And then after that, we'll eventually go into how you're actually going to connect your thermometers, which is a little bit more complicated.